Are quarantines constitutional? Hey friends, Rick Green here with today's Constitutional Minute. Too often we are willing to give up liberty for security or perceived safety. So today we're looking at the constitutionality of quarantines that have come to every neighborhood in the country. At first, a short answer, just right up front. Yes, quarantines are legal and necessary if the government has a compelling interest. So you should follow the direction of your local and state officials if those orders are constitutional. But there are definitely limits to this power. That's why we need to address this. When are they constitutional? When are they not? So that you'll know if you are justified in practicing civil disobedience. Now, as to the constitutionality, there are several important questions that are raised. First of all, who? Who has authority to issue a quarantine? Next question would be what? What are the criteria? How serious is the disease? What evidence of infection, the risk of infecting others, all those factors. What has to be, for instance, the bar? How has it got to be? Third question would be when? When can a governmental body call for that quarantine, and how long can that quarantine go? Such as ordering churches to close but allowing lumber stores to stay open. How far can a quarantine go? How many people can it affect, and does it have to be applied equally to everyone? Perhaps most importantly, of all the questions raised by a quarantine when it comes to the Constitution, certainly if it's you or your family member that's being put into isolation, you want to know where. Where do you go for due process? If it's your business that is going under because of this, where do you go for overturning these orders? What if you've actually been misdiagnosed? What if a government official shows up on your porch and says, I got papers that say you have this disease, I'm hauling you off to isolation, when you don't actually have the disease? Or how do you respond when the government measures are just too overblown for the particular situation? Now, we can't answer all those questions in one Constitutional Minute, so we're going to have a series of those available on the website. But today's Constitutional Minute, I want to focus on the first question, and that is who? Who has authority to issue quarantines? Then we'll tackle the other questions in future videos. Now look, I realize that in the midst of a pandemic, if you're in the midst of the chaos, people may not care much whether it's the states or the feds or local or which level of government has the power. And whether it's a quarantine or an isolation or the correct terminology. But that's kind of my whole point in starting this whole Constitutional Minute with a reminder that we must not give up liberty just for security or even a sense of security or safety. On a subject this serious, where your constitutional rights can and in many places are being violated, we must also think through the process. We have to slow down for a moment and process this. We need to know the rules for how this is all supposed to take place. So I think it's important to step back and talk a little bit of philosophy, if you'll allow me for a moment. This is something that we teach. It's a basic idea we teach at Patriot Academy every year. And it regards the concept of liberty as defined in Webster's 1828 dictionary. He basically said that when we live in a society with other people, we're going to give up natural liberty in exchange for civil liberty. And that any liberty that is infringed upon must be absolutely necessary for the safety of the entire society. So natural liberty, you could be living on an island somewhere and the only limitation on you is nature. But when you live in civil society, there are further limitations on your freedom that you give up in order to have a safe society. So look, I think we all agree that if someone has a deadly infectious disease. And since the data and the science are now showing that coronavirus is not anywhere near as deadly as we originally thought, just for this conversation about the constitutionality of quarantines, I want you to think about something worse, like Ebola. Ebola has a 50% mortality rate, 50% case fatality rate. That's on average. It's 25 to 90% in different places, but on average, that means 50% of the people that get it are going to die. Okay, COVID-19 is maybe 0.1%. So 99.9% of the people that get it are not going to die. So for sake of this conversation, just think Ebola. All right, and in that situation, I think we would all agree that if someone has that deadly a disease, it is highly infectious, and they're spreading it to other people, then our government should do its best to prevent that person from running around town and infecting everyone. That's where an infringement on that person's natural liberty, or even in this case civil liberty, is warranted and necessary. So now we got to come back to those other questions, okay? Who, what, when, and where. In other words, how do we practically handle this? Even if it's a disease that bad, who's supposed to do that? Is it the federal government that should be going in and quarantining and isolating? Is it state government, local government? What are the due process protections against abuses of that power, deciding to implement those things when it's not quite that bad? So I have to, I'm sorry for all the rabbit trails, but for this particular discussion, I need to run down another rabbit trail before I jump into the answering the constitutional question. Because there's an important distinction between two of the terms I've already used, quarantine and isolation. It's important because some governmental entities have authority to isolate but not quarantine. Here's the deal. Look, if you have a disease and you are detained, so you have the disease and you need to be set aside from other people so you don't get them sick, that is what we call isolation. If you came in contact with someone that had the disease, you've been exposed, but no one knows if you have the disease yet, then we call that quarantine. So think about it this way. If you were one of those cruise ships, or you were on one of those cruise ships, you wouldn't be one of the cruise ships, but if you were on one of those cruise ships, like the Diamond Princess, where this all, we heard about that one from the beginning, and it was a really good test to see scientifically what the outcome would be. But if you think back to that story, everyone on that boat was quarantined because they weren't, everybody had come in contact with everyone else on the boat. They weren't allowed to leave. So everybody was quarantined. But if they knew you had the disease, you had already tested positive for it, then you were actually isolated. So you were even put in a different place. So someone testing positive is going to be put in isolation and not allowed to have contact with other people. That is not quarantine. So remember the difference, isolation and quarantine. It's going to be important in terms of who has authority. So what does the Constitution say about both isolation and quarantine? Nothing. The Constitution does not have either of those words in it. It doesn't have pandemic in it. So it doesn't mean that the Constitution, that the Founding Fathers that gave us the Constitution hadn't thought about these things. Even though there's nothing specific in the Constitution referring to the issue of disease control, that was not a foreign concept to them. They dealt with smallpox, yellow fever, and other outbreaks. So make no mistake, the Founding Fathers personally saw the destruction of an out-of-control disease, and they believed it was a proper function of government to stop that spread when possible. I mean, signers of the Declaration like Benjamin Rush were heroes in the yellow fever of Philadelphia and other situations. So they had dealt with this. But they also believed that governments, and by the way, I should say government quarantines didn't start with the Founding Fathers either. That goes all the way back to the Old Testament. All right. So ironically, the word quarantine does come from an Italian word for 40, because that's how many days a ship had to be detained in Venice, Italy, way back in the 14th century. That's where we even get the word quarantine. You could fast forward from there to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They did the first quarantine law here in America. That was 1647. But let's not go too far down and get lost in history here. Just accept the fact that quarantines are a necessary function of government. So then we got to ask which government, who's supposed to be doing this? And like most police powers, the Founding Fathers thought this should be done by the states. At the time of the founding, that would have included even stopping a foreign disease, because the states themselves were dealing with people coming in to the country. So each state had its own rules for containment and at the respective ports of entry. And as you can imagine, this kind of created a patchwork of rules. And so over time, both with the new Constitution and then through the Commerce Clause, the federal government ended up taking over both quarantines and isolation of anyone that was coming into the U.S. Okay, so that's not Americans moving within America, but if someone was coming into the U.S., then the federal government could detain you at the national borders, either isolate you if you had the disease or quarantine you if they thought you had come in contact with someone. That was the federal role, but the state role still maintained authority over all the local people in those communities and in those states. Now listen, this is another one of our rabbit trails, but there's a lot of debate in legal circles about who currently has the power to enforce these things. So I'm going to get in the weeds for just a second because proper authority is very, very important when you're dealing with these constitutional issues and extreme restraint on liberty. This is where the distinction in the law between isolation and quarantine becomes important. Current federal statutes say that the federal government can detain you, it can isolate you, if you are both infected and you are believed to be moving towards crossing a state line. Now here's the catch. Or that you might infect someone else that is moving across the state line. So yeah, it's kind of a 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon thing that reaches pretty much everyone. The bottom line is if you test positive, then in most cases, the federal government will claim to have statutory authority to subject you to isolation. It doesn't mean they always will and probably shouldn't. It's best left to the states. And for the most part with COVID-19, the federal government has done that. If you were coming in from outside the country, the federal government was involved. But if you tested positive in your home state or community, they haven't gone in and tried to isolate you with federal folks. But they do have that authority under the statutes. They have that isolation authority if you have the disease. They do not have that authority to quarantine. So if you haven't been tested positive, you're just potentially had come in contact with someone that tested positive, the federal statutes do not give authority for the federal government to quarantine you, let alone to lock down the entire nation, okay? So at least according to statutory law passed by our Congress, by our representatives, they don't have the power to do that. Now, that's why in almost all these cases in the past, and even for the most part in this case, the CDC has suggested or recommended things, but it's been the governors and the mayors to actually put that thing in motion or that regulation in motion. I will say, look, if there had been a different president during all of this, you would most certainly have seen the federal quarantine. You would have seen a national lockdown because even though the statute passed by Congress does not include that authority, the regulations, and that's different, the regulations come from the bureaucrats over at Health and Human Services. Those regulations do give the federal government the power to not only isolate, but also to quarantine. And notice the difference. Our elected representatives, the federal law passed by them, the representatives in Congress, only gives isolation power if you have the disease. The regulations, so the statutes given by the Congress, only isolation power. The regulations given by the bureaucrats says they can even quarantine you. They have not done that yet, and we hope that doesn't happen. They tried to get President Trump to do that. More of the left-leaning politicians and the control people, they definitely wanted him to do it. They've been begging him to do it, and he has refused. And I think that he made the right decision constitutionally in doing that. Just a kind of a fun fact for you, though. These regulations adopted by these unelected bureaucrats at Health and Human Services, they've been expanding this power of quarantine and federal power. They have done this. They did that. They dropped those new regulations literally the day before President Trump took office 3 years ago. So I think that's fairly interesting. But look, the CDC's job in the past has been mostly technical. It's been assistance, research, laboratory services. But these new regs that they're trying to push, they give broad authority to the CDC. And thankfully, Trump has said no to those kind of things at the federal level. I think that's a good thing. We've seen the federal government actually typically mess these things up. It was the federal control through the FDA of the testing that caused us to not be able to get up and running in the testing as fast as we should have. It's been federal mandates, it's been government mandates on hospital beds and everything else that has caused the shortages that cause so much concern here. So enough of that. The less the federal government's involved, the better, and that's the way our laws are written. All right, I get it. In the middle of a pandemic, everybody just wants the disease to stop. They don't care if it's the feds or the states or whatever, but we need to think beyond that. We need to be more careful when granting new powers to any government, especially the federal government. And so I'm hoping when this thing is finally all over, maybe in a few months, I hope sooner. It could be longer if some of these dictator-like governors out there have their way. But at some point, we need to have a serious, rational discussion about which level of government gets these powers, who gets to enforce these things, and no matter what, how we can have some checks and balances on them, which we clearly do not have right now. Bottom line, take-home message for this video is yes, the government should be able to call for and enforce both isolation of infected persons and quarantine of exposed persons if there's a compelling interest. Now, that means a compelling interest, by the way, it's got to be so bad that they do the cost-benefit analysis and they say government has to intervene. And maybe in mid-March you could argue, yes, they had a compelling interest because everybody's watching Italy fall apart and we didn't want that to happen here. But it's got to be constitutional. It's got to be the proper form of government that's doing it, and there's got to be adequate due process to challenge that authority in order to prevent abuse. If we as a nation decide we want the feds handling every piece of this, then there should be a constitutional amendment to do that. You should never give new power to the federal government without a constitutional amendment. It should not be the opinion of the United States Supreme Court. It certainly should not be this unelected federal bureaucracy. So that the means for proper authority here is definitely state and local, not the feds. And in our next video, we're going to address who at the local and state level can do this and how to get some checks and balances on them. Because most of the abuse we're seeing right now in the COVID crackdowns is being done by mayors and governors, and they're acting like dictators and answering to no one. Doesn't sound very American, does it? We're going to tackle that one in our next Constitutional Minute. For now, I'm Rick Green, and this has been today's Constitutional Minute.